All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Carlos Rosales. I'm the Community Outreach and Engagement Associate here at Citizens Committee for Children of New York. With me, I'm with my colleague, Laura Jankstrom, who can introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Jankstrom, and I am the Director of Civic Engagement Programs at Citizens Committee for Children. It's so great to have you all here with us today.
So today, as you all know, we're here for our first webinar of the new year, What is Effective Advocacy? Where we'll walk you through some of the larger overview of the legislative budgeting process here in New York City, making sure that you are familiar with some of the institutions that we engage with in advocacy, as well as some tips and tools at your disposal to help those who are new at the budget advocacy process to engage in this landscape. Before I pass it off to Laura, who will be doing a little introductory activity, I wanted to just highlight a few things in relation to Zoom. First, everyone here, cameras are off and we have all participants joining us today muted. You can at any time during this presentation ask us a question using the chat box or in the Q&A box on your Zoom tool. If you have any issues in terms of hearing us or seeing us, or if you have a question in relation to one of the things that we're talking about, we'll be looking at those regularly so that way we can answer some of those questions, hopefully live. But if we do miss something, feel free to remind us when we get to the Q&A portion of the webinar. One last thing I'll also note is that this webinar is being recorded. So if you or colleagues or anyone you know are missing this webinar but wanted to join, not to worry, we'll make sure that this is available on our website and our YouTube page so that way you can view afterwards. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Laura, who will take us through the activity.
Thanks, Carlos. So just to get us warmed up a little bit and to get a sense of who is in the room, I'm just going to ask everybody to put into the chat your name, your pronouns, and one time that you've advocated. And I won't say more. I'll let you interpret what that means for now. Carlos, is the chat active? Are people able to?
Yes.
Here we go. Here we go. That was just taking a second. Wonderful. Thank you. Welcome, Angela. Thank you, Nessa. I hope I said that correctly. Wonderful. Great. So I see, folks talking about individuals that they've advocated for, children, clients, policies, myself, absolutely. Attending a rally at City Hall for sure. Some people have advocate in their title, right? We're all advocates in some way. Wonderful. So I want to welcome you all here today. I'm looking at who's in the room, and I know that there are some seasoned advocates. This may be a review for some people. I'm hoping that everybody does leave here with new information, though. For those of you who've been to CCC's Advocacy 101 workshops or webinars, this is just sort of an updated version of that. So feel free to chime in the chat if you are seeing anything that resonates with you or you just want to contribute. I feel like we can have robust dialogue even though we can't see each other because the Zoom chat function is a pretty effective way to do these webinars. All right, so I think, are just going to jump in. Carlos, if you want to go to the next slide. So before we jump into how to do effective advocacy, we need to have a common definition together of what we're talking about when we mean advocacy. So for us here at CCC, we define advocacy through a lens of policy change. So child advocacy is leveraging resources to apply pressure on decision makers to make the changes that families and communities want and need. Sometimes those changes involve funneling funds and resources to places and programs that need them. And sometimes the changes involve changes to policies or laws that govern our lives. But many times, as we'll see through the course of this workshop, we need both budget and legislative reforms at the same time. And there are different times of year, where it might make sense to really start to apply that pressure. And so when we say resources in our definition of advocacy, I think, the more the better. So much of our advocacy happens in partnership with other people and other organizations. Like, you absolutely cannot do this work alone. So the resources that different people and organizations bring to bear, some people have time to give to the cause, right? Others don't have time, but they may have money. We leverage our political connections, and sometimes CCC even has a lobbyist that helps us to increase our access to those with power. But we also rely heavily on our connections to people in the community, right? We know that some folks have really powerful personal stories that can go a long way in gaining public support for a specific cause. And at CCC, we rely really heavily both on quantitative and qualitative data to illustrate what is happening with children in New York City. We also have a great communications team and even a public relations firm to help us use the press, social media, and other platforms to get our messaging out. So I'll stop there and ask, what else do you think other organizations could leverage in terms of resources for advocacy? Excuse me, there is a beeping that I'm going to fix. Better. So if there's anything you think I missed, pop it in the chat. Something I want to pause here and just say is that it's really hard to know what the magic combination of things is going to be in advocacy to move the ball forward. And so it isn't ever just one thing. We really need all these different types of tactics and resources to make sure that we are gathering enough public and political will to really move our issues. I will ask Carlos to move to the next slide. So this is probably really small. And Carlos, I don't know if it's possible to drop a link in the chat. Let me drop a link in the chat to a PDF of this so that if you can't see what is displayed on the screen, here in the chat box is a link to what this document is, and you can kind of zoom in on your own computer and see what we're looking at. So what you are looking at here is an organizational chart of New York City government. So before we begin to talk about how to leverage our resources to apply pressure on decision makers, it's important for us to understand who those decision makers are, right? Because depending on what we're asking for, we need to know which lever of power to press. So what you're looking at now, at the top is sort of, in an organizational chart, the people at the top have the most power. And so what I really love about this chart is that who's at the top? It's us, right? The people of the city of New York. We vote these people into office. We pay their salaries with our taxes. So they work for us, right? And, it goes without saying, that doesn't mean their jobs are easy, right? Politicians have to make decisions every day about what they will prioritize, which would be easy if all of their constituents wanted the same things, right? But because the people they represent have different viewpoints about what is important, and because the role of advocates and lobbyists and special interest groups sort of play in all of this, there's constant work being done to educate and influence legislators and their staff in order to sway their priorities and their decision making. So this is really the space in which advocacy lives. And this is really the tactic that CCC uses. You know, we want to educate the public and also our elected officials on these issues so that they can make good decisions for children and families. So let's look who's next on the line. The next on the line are elected officials, right? So those are the offices that New York City community members sort of vote on. So I'll just sort of list them and then we'll go a little bit deeper into some of them. So you have the borough presidents, the comptroller, the mayor, the public advocate, 51 members of the city council, and the district attorneys. And then underneath those sort of positions are appointed positions. And then all the colorful boxes underneath are the city agencies. And you see that that's a direct line from the mayor down to all of those colorful boxes, right? He's in charge of hiring his deputy mayors, the school chancellor, right? All the people to run the various city agencies that make sure our city runs on a day-to-day basis. And so really the buck stops there. And so much of our advocacy is focused on the mayor. The mayor works right alongside the city council in negotiating budgets and passing bills. And so I think, you know, if the mayor is first, the city council is a close second in terms of, you know, what we're trying to influence. So let's take a deeper dive into some of these positions then. Carlos, next slide. Great. So most people in New York have heard of borough presidents, and many can probably name their own, but dig deeper and you'd probably find that most people don't know much about what the borough president does. So we'll start with fun fact. The role of borough president was created in 1898, which is the same year that the 5 boroughs went from being independent cities with their own mayors to 5 boroughs of one city. And so I always find this interesting because I think of this position as something that was created to sort of assuage the egos of people who were going to have to give up their positions of power as mayor of these disparate cities. A lot of people think of borough presidents as ceremonial figureheads and cheerleaders, like advocates for the borough's interests to the mayor and powers that be at the state level. And indeed, this is true. Borough presidents should be able to advocate directly to the mayor and city agencies and have their ear. But New York City being the city that it is, one could argue that a borough president's most important function is to influence land use in their borough. So land use can mean a lot of things, most notably what gets built where, what buildings can be used for, who gets a liquor license. So while borough presidents don't have decision-making authority, they do have a lot of influence and can hold public hearings for the community to weigh in. And these can garner considerable press attention, which brings with it the ability to change that public and political will that I was talking about. Borough presidents also get millions of dollars from the city budget to distribute as they see fit. So this is called discretionary funding. Anything the city isn't funding that the borough president supports can greatly benefit from a borough president's discretionary fund. So here is an advocacy opportunity, right? If you think the borough president should be spending his or her discretionary funds a certain way, you know, you can let them know that. And we'll talk about strategies to engage or influence elected officials a little bit later. Borough presidents also appoint community board members. So, you know, community boards are the most local form of government in New York City. Each one is made up of 50 voluntary members tasked with addressing local complaints, like and zoning and land use issues. They also make recommendations for the city budget, but it's like they do so much. And you know, if you've been to one community board, you've been to one community board. They're all very different. And much like the borough presidents themselves, though, community boards do not have decision-making power, but do carry influence with community members who do have a vote. And so here's another, you know, advocacy opportunity alert, right? So first of all, as an individual, you can become a public member or apply to be an appointed member of your community board. And there you can have your voice heard on the issues that you care about. So you can look up your community board very easily just by Googling, look up my NYC community board. And I would say, you know, if you haven't ever attended a meeting, they're probably virtual now. But you really don't have anything to lose, and you could find that it's something that you're interested in getting more involved in. And then before we move on, one more thing I always want to say when we talk about community boards and advocacy is this, right? With all of the attempts to curb family homelessness, right, there's dozens of new shelters that are scheduled to be built across the city in the coming years. And with reforms to the juvenile justice system over the last several years, new juvenile detention and placement facilities may be needed. So, you know, and also as young people age out of the foster care system, we need transitional housing to ensure that they can start living independently. And, you know, even as New York City students call for integration of the school system, right? We need schools that welcomes kids from every neighborhood. And a huge reason that it's so hard to build these facilities and advance equity in New York City schools is community opposition, right? So when one of these fights inevitably comes to your community, you can go to these meetings and be the person who stands up at the community board meeting and says, I stand with homeless families, right? Or I stand for second chances, or I stand for equity and opportunity for all, instead of not in my backyard. Right, because all the people that show up for these meetings are angry about these things coming in. It's really important to have other voices in the community standing up for, you know, all New Yorkers. So I will get off my soapbox here and we can move on to the next slide. Great. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the mayor. So this is an image of New York City's previous and current mayors at City Hall, where the mayor's office is located. In fact, the mayor's staff occupies an entire wing in City Hall, with the other wing used for public hearings and other business of the City Council. So I mentioned before, the mayor is responsible for the management and delivery of government programs and services. So he's responsible for all the city agencies that administer these programs and services. So I would say go back to that big chart when you get a chance and really look at them. You'll to get a sense of sort of how complex our city is. You know, the New York City mayor is dealing with the largest school system in the country, over which control is centralized at the level of the mayor. He's dealing with the NYPD and the fire department. How much trash do you think the Department of Sanitation deals with every day, right? The childcare system, the child welfare, juvenile justice systems, housing, homelessness, parks, libraries, all of the systems that impact children, families, and communities. The mayor is accountable for how they function, right? Now, if you have an issue, you can try to advocate directly with the city agencies, but like I said before, the buck stops with the mayor. You're not going to get anywhere without layers of bureaucracy standing in the way if you're trying to go to ACS with a child welfare complaint, right? You're better off trying to influence the mayor himself. And in addition to administering the city agencies, the mayor must also create budget plans for how the city will take in and spend funds. So he must negotiate with the city council, whose job it is to adopt the mayor's budget plan each year. And we're going to talk a lot about the budget process in a couple of minutes. All right, next slide, Carlos. So next we have the public advocate. So there's often confusion about the role of the public advocate, since they cannot vote along with the city council, but they may introduce legislation. So according to the public advocate's website, the public advocate serves as an ombudsman for city government, providing oversight for city agencies, investigating citizens' complaints about city services, and making proposals to address perceived shortcomings or failures of those services. So the public advocate serves on the committee which selects the director of the New York City Independent Budget Office, which we love, and appoints members of several boards and commissions, including one member of the New York City Planning Commission. The public advocate also serves as chair of the Commission for Public Information and Communication. And along with the mayor, the public advocate is one of 3 municipal offices elected by all the city's voters. So it's the mayor, the comptroller, and the public advocate are the only 3 offices that all New Yorkers vote for. The others are broken, you know, your city council person only just, you're sort of council district votes were. In the event of a vacancy or incapacity of the mayor, the public advocate is actually first in line to become mayor, which I did not know for a very long time. So I thought that was interesting. So this position is really about influence, right? About being a good government watchdog. And it's a great platform for politicians that prioritize ethics and accountability. But much like the borough presidents, the office is largely what the individual elected to the role makes it. So our current public advocate, Jumaane Williams, was a previous New York City council member. And since he has the power to introduce, inform, and support new legislation, and because the role necessitates that he hold government accountable, the public advocate, I would say, is someone to engage in your advocacy efforts, particularly if your issue is one that you know, like that particular public advocate has a history of supporting. All right, next slide. So next up, we have the city council. This map rendering here is the 51 council districts. These districts do overlap with community districts, so not perfectly. So you can have 2 or even 3 council members that share boundaries within a community district. I don't know, somebody planned that long ago to really drive us crazy here in the city because they also don't overlap with school districts, right? So it's difficult. The people of each council district elect their city council member every 4 years. And they term limit out after 2 consecutive 4-year terms. Each city council member has an office within his or her own district that is open to the public that you should be able to go in and visit, as well as a legislative office at 250 Broadway, which is right across the street from City Hall. So when reaching out to your council member to discuss a concern, you might consider bringing community concerns to the district office, broader policy concerns to the legislative office. But if you reach out to either, they'll be able to direct you to the appropriate person to start a conversation about whatever it is your issue is. And I think the last thing for this slide I'll say is, if you think about the mayor as like the city's executive branch, then the city council is the legislative branch, if you're comparing it to sort of Congress, right? Next slide. So this is a hearing room, the New York City hearing room. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about, well, let me just talk about it now. So like I said, the New York City Council introduces and votes on legislation. They negotiate and approve the city's budget with the mayor. But this third budget is sort of what I want to focus on now. They monitor the city agencies, right? So if the mayor is responsible for, running the agencies, the city watches them, right? To make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And oftentimes they call people from the city agencies to the hearing room to have oversight hearings, to ask questions about the way the agency is running things, particularly, if there's been like a lot of negative press or attention, or with ACS, if there was a child fatality, right? Like they could be something like that, or they could just be mundane oversight hearings that kind of happen every week. But either way, it's the responsibility of the city council to call those people to account in front of the public. So these hearings are public, and CCC goes to testify at hearings weekly. And I encourage any of you who might have an issue that they want to speak out on, you can go to the city council website. They have a hearings calendar. You can look it up and see, hey, the city council is having an oversight hearing with the Department of Education on remote learning. I really want to see what they've got going on. You can tune into the hearing. They're virtual now. If they are in person, this is a beautiful historic hearing room. If you've never been, please do go just to be in it. It's amazing. And you can just kind of sit and watch. Or if you have something to say, you can testify. And it's not difficult at all. And so at the end of this, we will we'll leave our contact information, and if testifying before the city council is something that you're interested in and you want to kind of dig deeper into, I'd be happy to have a follow-up conversation about how you can do that. So I think that's all I'll say about the city council for now. I'm going to stop and take any questions because we're going to kind of move on to something else.
Okay, I believe we have a question from Crystal. So Crystal, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask a question. I'm not seeing you unmuted, Crystal. So if you have a question, if you have trouble unmuting yourself, go ahead and just type it in the chat box, or we'll circle back with you during the Q&A.
Great. All right. So we've been talking a lot about how the mayor and the city council have to negotiate and approve the budget, right? That is an area that is really ripe for advocates to sort of influence what is happening in the city, is within the city budget process. So before we talk about the budget process, I just want you to understand sort of the scope of the city budget, where we get our money, how we spend our money. And so let's start. So what you see here is our city revenue. So, you know, there was deep cuts across the board due to the coronavirus pandemic. This budget is $7 billion less than we expected at this time last year. So that's just bad. There's going to be cuts where nobody's going to be happy with the budget. But there, I think, is still room to advocate for, you know, the issues that we see with it. So what you see here in the green is the tax revenue from just New York City taxes, right? So living in New York City is different than living in any other city in the country, just in terms of sheer size and revenue. There are over 8.6 million people living in New York City. And if you compare that to Los Angeles, which is the second most populated city in the country, it only has about 4 million residents. So we're more than twice as large. In fact, there are more people living in the 5 boroughs of New York City than are living in 34 of our nation's states. And in addition to being an incredibly populous city, we also have local taxes that most of these 8.6 million people contribute to through income tax, sales tax, and property tax. So if you add the revenue from our local taxes to the revenue we receive from the state, which is in the orange, and federal block grants, which is in the gray, New York City has an annual budget of $88.19 billion for the coming fiscal year. Again, the New York City budget is bigger than most state budgets, approximately the same size as the state of Florida, right? So you can see here that we got about $15 billion from the state and about $7 billion from the federal government. And so, you know, the good news on that is we are able to shelter, we have been able to shelter ourselves from some, you know, drastic federal cuts that came down through Medicaid over the last several years, right? And oftentimes, many of you may know, our mayor and our governor are at odds. And lots of times in recent budgets, the governor has shifted a lot of costs to New York City because he knows how much our tax revenue is and that we can kind of afford to pay a little bit more, not that we should, right? Not that the state should be shifting costs to the city, right? So let's now move on and look at, if this is our revenue, right? If this is all the money that we take in, how are we spending this $88.19 billion? So the next slide will show you that, right? Here you can see what we spend on education, social services, public safety and judicial, health, housing. parks and recs, all of the services that are vital to helping children thrive. So with the largest public school system in the country, serving 1.1 million school children, it's not a wonder that our largest spending is on education, though there is work to be done with respect to serving all school children equitably. So with more than half of New York City's children living in poverty, we also have robust spending on the social safety net, though families and providers still report barriers to accessing needed social services. So I just drop in the chat, like, is there anything here that surprises you? I feel like when I do this in person, people have like visceral reactions to what they're seeing. So just if you had a reaction, feel free to drop it into the chat and I'll just wait like 30 seconds in case anybody does. All right, well, while we're waiting for reactions to this slide, what is debt service? I actually don't know. That's a good question. I'm gonna get back to you on that one. I have no idea what debt service is. Carlos, does anybody here know? Fringe benefits are, you know, like insurance, vacation, pensions for city employees. Caitlin thinks housing is very low. Yeah, that's interesting. Housing is like more of a federal program. I think a lot of the housing subsidies and vouchers come from federal block grants. Thank you, Vicki. There are people in the chat that are smarter than I that know what debt service is. All right, well, I want to do one more slide for those of us who are like really wonky and into budgets. And the next slide shows, you know, it breaks down how much each of these sectors receives by city, federal, and state revenues. So we can see here that we get just $15 billion of our budget from the state, most of which goes towards education, right? And we get just $7 billion from the federal government, about half of which goes to social services. So an important note here is that much of our education and social services sector rely on funding outside of New York City, right? So according to the comptroller, 40% of the Administration for Children's Services budget, 34% of the Department of Homeless Services budget, and 16% of the Social Services Human Resources Administration budget come from federal grants, right? So, you know, at the end of the day, it doesn't mean just because New York City has a robust budget and we're able to protect ourselves from some cuts that come through from the federal and the state, the cuts are affecting the most vulnerable people, children, right? More than anybody else, right? Because if those cuts come down, they're coming to education. Education is going to take a hit. Social services is going to take a hit. Housing is going to take a hit, right? And so that's why we also do federal advocacy on these issues. So at the end of the day, though they are large, these are just numbers that need to be scrutinized with respect to how resources are advocated and are allocated. And that is very much at the heart of what we do with our budget advocacy. Every year when the mayor comes out with his budget proposals, our policy analysts do the fancy math to see what's changing in terms of resource allocation, AKA budget cuts, and create our budget priorities around restoring or increasing funding in the areas that service providers, communities, and families say they need the most. So all of these documents we analyze can be found at the city's Office of Budget and Management. So I can put that in the chat box as soon as I turn it over to Carlos. So the last slide on the budget is the process. So this is happening. It's happening right now. This is why we're doing this. So by January 16th, the mayor releases the preliminary budget for the upcoming fiscal year. He did it early this year. So our staff were scrambling to figure out the state and the city budget proposals at the same time, which was interesting. And now is when all of the negotiations start to happen, right? So at the city level, the mayor, releases the preliminary budget. There's hearings that are going to be held between now and April 26th, and those hearings really influence the mayor's executive budget, which is kind of just tweaked based on sort of what happened at the hearings, what was the public response to the budget, what are the advocates saying, right? So this gives him an opportunity to kind of read the room and change things before we really get into budget negotiations, which happens later in the spring, like May and June. And so that's where you'll see CCC staff sort of on the steps of City Hall, either doing rallies or testifying at these budget hearings, taking meetings with elected officials, trying to get all of our volunteers to come with us, the youth that we work with to come with us and talk about how these issues are going to impact them. But this is really, I think you'll see the sort of late winter and spring months, is there's a lot of action in the advocacy realm. And so we will now, I think, go into, when we say advocacy, like what is that and what do we mean? So thank you all for listening to me. Oh wait, Carlos wants me to do this one more slide. Sorry. Participatory budgeting. I think I'm probably talking too much, so I'm gonna just drop a link to a video that's fun to watch. You can watch it on your own time about participatory budgeting. It does a much better job explaining it than I probably would anyway. And now I'll turn it over to you, Carlos.
Well, thank you, Laura, for all that information. So now I want to spend like a few moments talking about some of the tools and ways people have engaged in advocacy, as well as some good tips I think that would be helpful for anyone who's interested in using some of these methods. So first, I just want to go over, kind of give a comprehensive overview of some of the advocacy tools we use to engage elected officials and public leaders. And now this is not an all-inclusive list. I think there's many more ways to also engage in advocacy. I think that folks have raised in the chat earlier on, and we'll be touching on a few more too beyond these. But through CCC, I'm sure for those who have been subscribed to our emails, that these are some of the top ways that we engage those public leaders and elected officials. The first are typically, I'll talk about the first two, call-in days and letter writing campaigns. So it's very important, I think, that when we're engaging elected officials, that we kind of put some type of public record or a statement to them. That way they know, about important issues that that are important to us, are important to our communities, and that we're advocating for in our work. So oftentimes when we organize things like call-in days or letter writing campaigns, all of these points of contacts that elected officials received are actually cataloged and noted as part of the public record. So whenever we give a call to an elected official, and really in a day, sometimes it's one official, sometimes it's many, depending on the issue and the stakeholders that we're engaging. But we use phone calls and writing of letters to make sure that we make sure those offices are well aware. And it's not just being received by elected officials, it's also being received by staff and some maybe points of contact in those elected official offices who might be more deeply involved in a legislative issue or an issue that's important to you, and recognize some of the more key details that we put through those efforts and can kind of run it up the chain on their end to their elected leader. Another way you see us engage, and this is often usually through social media, but it can be letter writing as well, is e-actions or email actions. And typically, I think, as you've seen on CCC's website, if you've worked with us before in one of our advocacy issues, is we, draft a letter to public officials. We on our end, we typically support the advocates that we're engaging, and write a letter to the official, so that way you aren't necessarily having to write the message. We craft the message for you, highlighting in broad strokes what the issue is and some of the priorities that we want to push towards that issue, and ask our network, our communities, and our advocates that we engage with to send them to their own elected officials, so that way they could kind of ring the bell on issues that are also important through that type of mechanism. And of course, we also, I think it's important to allow uh, the voice of the person who is sending this e-action to their elected official to also write in a few words of their own. So we always typically provide space for anyone engaging on an issue through this way to submit content and also write their own message if they desire to do so. Another way we engage kind of the public space, and oftentimes this happens at hearings, is through public testimony. Usually that's in the form of our policy and advocacy team who goes to the various hearings on issues. I think some of those most recent ones have been related to childcare affordability and to housing and homelessness, have been a few notable testimonies that we spoke on. But we go to these hearings and testify before committees or groups who are taking on legislative matters or a general inquiry in the public on these issues, and kind of highlight where we stand and kind of what some of the priorities are as it relates to the needs that children and families are facing throughout the city. So it's a very effective tool, not only for the person involved doing this work, but I think it also provides opportunities in some cases when we do this work through coalitions to invite families, to invite community members, or to invite someone who's been affected by this issue to speak to a group of people that may not always have direct contact with this person. And then lastly, as you see during this budget advocacy cycle, we use meetings with elected officials as well. Of course, during the pandemic, these meetings are going to be organized through a virtual format, but nonetheless, these are meetings that we can still organize and have one-on-one conversations with elected officials who are either working on the issue or part of a committee, whether it be in Albany in City Council or New York State's Senate and Assembly bodies, and organize that so that way we can bring in our policy experts, but as well as, again, the people who are affected by those, whether they be families, youth involved in some type of program, typically come. And that's another great opportunity to have more face-to-face interaction, one-on-one with elected officials who are oftentimes, I think, champions of some of the issues that we're working on. So the next thing I want to highlight is social media as a tool. And typically we would normally during this webinar have more slides on social media specifically because it's become such an impactful and powerful way to engage everyone within the advocacy landscape. But I will say before I kind of give a few words on this, that CCC is actually now going to be providing a webinar that's dedicated especially towards social media engagement or digital engagement rather, when we're using that for advocacy. So towards the end, I'll highlight some of the upcoming webinars that we have. So stay tuned for that. I think what I'll say in regards to social media as a tool is essentially this. Nowadays, we know more and more public officials are using this, not only public officials, but the media has been using social media as a tool to engage not only constituents, but on different policy and legislative issues as well. So we know it's been an increasing way, effective way to engage a wide audience and to adopt and use consistent messaging over a longer period of time for different advocacy efforts impacting families and children. So, some of the elements I think that we are going to be highlighting further in this upcoming webinars are things that we need to consider, such as understanding what key or strategic advocacy periods exist, so that way we know when we need to act, as well as defining messages that would influence the target audience, because social media and some of the more recent tools have enabled us now to be more targeted and more specific towards crafting messages that impact sometimes a more specific group of people. And social media definitely has enabled us to do that uh, uh, in a way that can be more effective. We also want to emphasize and think about how or what we are directing our audiences to, and how we're expanding and tracking the reach of our messages, enabling us to see like the different levels of impact that some of these messages have to the audience that we're reaching. I think another important tip and a highlight that we'll be sharing in that webinar will probably be including sample social media posts that can do different things. Just as there are different ways and different social media platforms available, some of them do different things. So some of our social media platforms are better suited to inform or educate or tell a story. Some of them are better suited to direct action and make sure that people do a certain thing. When we think about using Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, you typically say that Instagram is the place where we can tell stories, and it's a very effective tool at storytelling. Whereas Twitter can sometimes be a way to keep people informed and provide up to the minute updates, as well as direct people towards action snippets. And Facebook, in some ways, Facebook has done a combination of those two things, but also create community in itself with using different tools like Facebook groups and other features that that social media platform has. And then lastly, I think I'll just say that, when engaging in social media days of action and this type of advocacy, know who you are engaging and target specific messages to specific people, both your allies and then the people that you hope to influence. And we'll kind of see more of this in some of the case studies, as well as I think that webinar that we'll be doing later this winter and early spring. Lastly, before I show you a video of one of our case studies on CCC's campaigns, I just want to talk about something that someone mentioned earlier. I think it was Angela, on some of the other ways we can engage, notably through rallies, press conferences, and protests. I want to first say that, New Yorkers have the right to engage in protest activities on public sidewalks, in public parks, and on public streets of New York City. That includes the right to distribute handbills or leaflets, the right to hold press conferences, demonstration and rallies, and the right to march on public sidewalks and in public streets. In some cases, the city does impose restrictions on these activities, and in some instances, you need to obtain a permit before engaging in certain activity. We'll be sending you, when we send the materials after this, you'll have the link to this information where you can go to it online. But I just wanted to highlight some of the things and some of the distinctions where you do need a permit versus what you do not need a permit for. So everyone here is clear on that. You do not need a permit to distribute any handbills. You do not need a permit to have a demonstration, rally, or a press conference on a public sidewalk. And you do not need a permit to march on a public sidewalk. What you do need a permit for is whenever there's some type of amplified sound or audio equipment being used, when there's more than 20 people in a public park, when you're marching on a public street, and when, sometimes, as you can see here, when you're on the City Hall steps, you can call actually the NYPD precinct number 5 Community Affairs Division, who actually handles some of the logistics around organizing rallies, protests, or conferences on the steps of City Hall. And again, there will be a link going out to everyone after this that will provide more information on how to organize some of these activities and what steps you need to do with some of the city institutions. And lastly, before we go to questions, I just want to highlight a case study from one of our campaigns, the Campaign for Children. Give me one second.
I go to after school. I go to after school Mondays through Fridays. It's fun. It's a way to get homework done. We do youth leadership and they teach us how to be young leaders and change the world.
When I started after school, I was really happy because I liked the activities that they were giving me and all the opportunities. They had my favorite sports. They had the things that interested me.
The main thing about after school is you get to have a learning experience that you never had before. It's not particularly about math, science, and literature, but it's learn about it hands-on and learn about why and who and why we do these things.
Through after school, they are learning skills and getting opportunities they would not otherwise receive in their normal day-to-day school schedule. After school provides them with the space to just even get a glimpse of who they want to be and give them the opportunity to possibly find out what kind of career they want to go into. That way, once they get into high school and college, they're not really thrown into it.
The mayor's preliminary budget, which was introduced in early February, did not include funding over 34,000 middle school students to attend summer program. These are middle school students who are currently enrolled in after-school programs created by the de Blasio administration.
It is unfair for parents and providers to let this budget cut go through a typical budget dance process, where we wait for the city council to step in and save summer programs in June when programs start the first week in July. Parents need to know where their children will be in the summer.
Summer programs give us social and developmentally appropriate activities to engage in. Summer programs keep us safe. Summer programs have been proven to prevent summer learning loss. Without summer programs, parents might not be able to work. Youth will be at home or on the street.
You might think an extra 3 hours in a school or spending a summer in a school building is boring, but with summer camp, it makes every hour amazing and engaging. Please fund our summer camp. You won't regret it. Don't be a bummer. Save our summer. Don't be a bummer. Save our summer.
Without summer programs, we don't have somebody to give us money to do this. We don't have somebody to open the doors for college. If they were to take that away from us, many students wouldn't be as successful as they are today.
Without these programs, we're just going to hear another news segment of something potentially negative happening in our community. Whereas if we allow more students to actually flourish and develop their personal and intellectual skills, I think this is going to allow them to, better remain focused in school, let alone go to and pursue college.
A lot of our parents do work, and that doesn't allow for them to pick their child up at 2:30. So after school is somewhere where
Carlos, the audio's not working.
Where they feel comfortable. This is where they are who they are and who they want to be.
Yeah, we just totally lost it.
Without after school, I don't think for one today I would be student body president, let alone have this enthusiasm about coming to school and actually learning something new.
Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure why that happened, but we'll make sure we'll send a link to everyone so that way they can see the entire video at your time. So I think we'll open it up now to any questions that folks have. And again, feel free to enter in the chat box or raise your hand if you'd like to speak up with us.
There was a question in the chat about is amplified sound include a bullhorn? And the answer is yes. I did drop into the chat a link from the NYCLU that has all the phone numbers and links to how you can get a permit, and it's updated now to include information about protesting and demonstrating safely during COVID. I'll put my my email address into the chat in case anybody thinks of questions later or would like to touch base. If you have an idea for something you want to do in terms of advocacy and you just want to talk to somebody about it, I'd be happy to be a listening ear.
Yes, again, Angela, and for everyone attending, links will be sent to you. Calvin, some of this is this information in your risk ranking resource book. So I think our data and advocacy publications and briefs, they contain different types of content. So it's depending on the publication. The risk ranking data book is much more informed behind some of the data resources on different child and family well-being indicators. And actually, we'll kind of conclude this webinar with these last few slides. These are some just highlights of some of CCC's briefs and data publications.
Carlos?
Yes?
Sorry, there's one more question before you move on.
Okay, yeah.
So Nancy's asking if COVID will change traditional advocacy. I mean, I guess we'll see, but it certainly is now very different than what it used to be. The rallies that used to take place on the steps of City Hall are now taking place on Zoom and being live streamed on Facebook and Instagram. A lot of sort of letter writing and call-in stuff has kind of shifted to Twitter. The meetings that we're having with elected officials are now virtual meetings. And so I think much like everything, the world may stay hybrid for a while. And hopefully, my hope is that we take the best parts of what we've learned from being remote, which is that, in a lot of ways, this makes advocacy accessible to a lot more people who might not be able to get on a bus and go to Albany, make it down to City Hall because they're working, for a 12 o'clock rally, right? And so in some instances, it makes advocacy accessible to the folks who are directly impacted by a lot of these issues. But in other ways, community is important and being together is important. And so my hope is that we'll have the best of both worlds.
Great. So before I let everyone go, I just wanted to highlight, if you visit our website, and I'll have a slide with the links, you can download all, if not most, of our policy briefs and data publications. Just now, we've actually released a new child and family well-being resource at the state level, looking at data on various counties in New York State. So if you're an organization that does work beyond New York City, that information is very new and would be useful to your organization's work. Our database, data.cccnewyork.org, also has many of this information where you can look to explore different data sets available, some of the latest on communities ranking by risk, a mapping of community resources that are available, as well as other pieces of information that you could view, download, and help you use towards your advocacy efforts that are ongoing. And then lastly, like I mentioned before, there's going to be a couple of webinars that are available to you. The next one is actually later this Thursday, which will be on the State Child and Family Wellbeing Index. That is going to be this Thursday, the 28th at 1 p.m. The registration is on our website. If you go to the Take Action tab at the top, you'll be able to see the listing for our calendar. And then we'll be doing a bunch of things in relation to the city index that's going to be released later in the winter or early spring 2021. The leveraging digital media for effective advocacy, which I mentioned earlier, will also be occurring as we get closer to the city budget advocacy cycle. We'll be having a number of mayoral candidate forums that are up and coming. And then I think Laura will like to plug in some of our CCC civic engagement programs that she's also conducting as well.
Yeah,
And definitely more to come.
Yeah, I just wanted for those of you who are not familiar with CCC civic engagement programs, sort of if you want to become involved with CCC's advocacy, become a youth or adult volunteer with us, sort of the point of entry, I guess, to sort of becoming an official sort of CCC community member is what we call the community leadership course. And so we have one for adults and one for youth. And we'll be recruiting for both of them soon. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I did put my email in the chat. You can reach out to me and I can put you on a list to get the applications when they come out.
And with that said, we just want to say thank you again to everyone who's participated. Again, this will be recorded and sent out to you in a follow-up email. I know a bunch of people have requested some pieces of information, so we'll be sure to reach out to you individually or collectively. But definitely, please reach out to either Laura or myself, and we'll be able to get in touch with you about information that you're looking for, resources available for you.